Now that we know how we can recognize different classification of ideas in terms of how they are organized and how they are being represented into group, let us now look at how do we represent these ideas? In how many ways do we try to represent the things that we encounter from our environment? You see, you have your encounter to the external world. And from this encounter, from this experience that we gather information from our encounter to the environment as we engage in our 3D space continuum, we're trying to organize and represent the external world to our internal world. And this representation of ideas has to have some organization in a way that is meaningful for us. So the term mental representations, these are the contents in our mind when we're trying to construct the idea, when we are referring to that particular idea. So if you are trying to refer to a particular concept, you're constructing internally what this concept is about before we try to convey it verbally to other individual. Let's say if you weren't able to mentally represent a concept in your own way, if you lack understanding in the first place, then you wouldn't be able to communicate this, or you won't be able to convey this concept that you are trying to grapple. If you yourself if it's unclear to you what this is, then the mental representation of a concept to you will also be fuzzy. The lack of understanding or the lack of mental representation of a particular concept would entail lack of clarity as well. But we're not deep we're not deep diving into some clarity of an idea. The mere fact that you're able to construct an image or a symbol in trying to refer to a particular concept, that in itself is already a cognitive activity. These mental representations, these are the contents in your mind, these are your thoughts about the concepts that you hold. These are the things that come to mind whenever you are trying to pinpoint a particular concept as you are trying to run or entertain your train of thoughts. So the mental representations of concepts can come in different forms. For example, one is analogical and the other is symbolic. In analogical, by the term analogy, we are trying to look for similarities of some things around what we encounter, or we are looking for particular characteristics of that concept and refer to the closest understanding that we have about the world. So, for example, when we are looking for the idea or the concept of a cat, we are looking for or we're imagining the specific details of what for us makes a cat. Such characteristics could include their whiskers, the shape of their ears, having four legs, having fur, having a tail. So these details, these characteristics would entail your analogical representation or a particularly a mental image of a cat that if we try to draw it, even using simple lines without using the shading or 3D elements, we can convey the idea of a cat, the concept of a cat, by incorporating the essential details or characteristics of what a cat should resemble. In mental images, particularly, these are the usual analogical representation when we think of particular objects. It has its perceptual characteristics. When we need to say perceptual, we are referring to the stimuli, the components of stimuli that make up a particular image. For example, you can think of height. You can think of volume, you can think of depth, you can think of shades. So these are perceptual qualities of an idea or of a concept wherein you're trying to hold together to come up into a, into a mental image. So in your mind, you're able to construct a representation of a perceptually imagined concept or object or an abstract idea of the thing that you're trying to refer to. Now, another thing is the symbolic representation. For instance, when we're trying to build our vocabulary, so if it were in Filipino or in English, arbitrarily, we've come up to develop our vocabulary and collectively agree that when we spell CAT, we're referring to this word, a cat. We agreed that this is our pronunciation to it. We agreed that this particular symbol is trying to represent, symbolically represent the thing that we're trying to imagine of what a cat is like. Having whiskers, a tail, four-legged bird, feline creature, wherein this symbol becomes meaningful without even describing entirely the key characteristics of what a cat should be like. Merely by looking at the symbol CAT arbitrarily, we come up with an agreement that this particular symbol is referring to a particular concept. So we are building all these symbolic knowledge representation, so our vocabulary when we are learning a language, to convey ideas in a smooth manner by using these different representations such as in language. So we can it can be conveyed, let's say, in visual, such as looking at the spelling, having a composition of these letters, and also it can also be a symbolic representation when you hear the word cat. So in this manner, we have different forms, but they all refer to the same thing. You can imagine the features, the actual characteristics, that's the analogical representation. Then the word that represents that idea, the concept of a cat, using the words cat, spelled CAT, or when you hear the word or the sound cat. So all these different forms, again, are conveying one idea or conveying the same idea. So you have different forms of mental representations of one idea. Sometimes when we represent an idea, again, because it can come in many forms, let's say you are holding one particular representation but not the other. Let's say you are more familiar, or what comes to mind easier is an image rather than the word, for example, or vice versa. Then whichever mental representation that you are holding on for a particular idea can influence your subsequent ideas. For example, when I think about the analogical representation of a cat, I might be thinking next about a lion or a tiger. Whereas when I think about the cat as a word, I will now the next idea or word that I have more affinity into recalling would be bat, rat. So you see, on the latter example, I have different representation that led me to think of other words that has similar sound or similar, almost similar in spelling of the word cat. Whereas on the former example, mental representation, I think of its features. That's why it's easier for me to think about other animals that may have the same visual characteristics. So your mental representation is important because your subsequent ideas can be influenced by whichever representation that you have. So this is now connected to another point that we are about to make, which is the difference between a picture and and an image. So the picture is the actual stimulus that you were able to encounter from your environment. Whether this is ambiguous or not, in however way you interpret this picture becomes internally simulated in your mind. And in however way you interpret it, that is now your mental image. That is now the image. So, for example, in these two pictures in our slides, you can imagine two different things in relation to what you are seeing. But in your mental representation of the stimulus, you were able to come up with one or two. So, for example, on the right side, you can think of a duck facing left or a rabbit facing right. So now, by using one picture, you were able to come up with two mental images. So you see, they are different. A picture is different from an image. An image is now the mental representation of your interpretation of the external stimulus. Moving forward, now, what we just discussed is the process of thinking because you were able to transform your sensation, interpret it, and construct your own image of what an external stimulus is like for you when you're interpreting it. So what comes to mind when you're trying to recall or retrieve from your memory the concept that you would like to retrieve will now be the mental image instead of the picture. So, what we are doing now, this is the process of thinking in itself because we are now applying these mental representations in different ways. For example, when you see the picture, you analyze it. So, you label this could be the ears, this could be the face, this could be the eyes, this could be the nose. And when you interpret the picture and you encoded it in a certain way and retrieve it in a certain way, these processes, the way you're trying to analyze, the way you're trying to process the mental representations is now the actual process of thinking. So this is your this is the process of you trying to manipulate or you trying to store, you trying to analyze or solve some problems that you are working on to different mental representations that you are holding. Why is this important? So you can think of different scenarios wherein your mental representations of ideas can be connected to other mental representation of ideas so that when you encounter a novel situation, you can easily retrieve a network of ideas that are meaningfully related. So we refer to schema as our mental construct or a cluster or collection of related concepts. For example, when we are in a restaurant or when you are in a library, you can easily understand that there is a set of norms on how you should behave. You can call this as a cognitive script, wherein you have a certain set of assumptions pertaining to a particular idea because it is connected to other ideas that would make it meaningful. So, in our way of trying to make sense of the world, we're trying to organize different concepts in the way that is meaningful for us in order to act on our environment that can be helpful for us in terms of navigating different events in when we engage in our environment, when we engage in different social situations. So we keep on collecting these concepts and we are making connections on these concepts. And by the way we are trying to make these relationships, we are now building our schemata. Or when we activate a particular schema, we're now easily tapping on many other concepts because they are connected meaningfully according to, let's say, a particular function, or maybe because of the taxonomy, or maybe because of the past experience you had. And by tapping on this, it will become very effective on how you deal with novel situations by just tapping on your network of concepts working together, having relationships with one another that will inform you on how you should act on a particular situation.